Now we have the microphone on, so you can probably now hear me, which is even better. Okay, yeah, today was one of those crazy days. I had my wife and I had both grandkids today, and it was they keep us on our toes here. Let me go ahead and go live on Instagram, and we will get that rolling and rocking and rolling here in a second here. So, okay. So again, I hope everybody's doing well. Today is June 17th, 2026. I hope you're all doing well. Been a busy, busy week. I have 4 hearings this week. I have the last one tomorrow, had 2 on, I don't know if it was Monday or Tuesday, and 1 on Tuesday, I think. They all went pretty well. And then the one tomorrow is going to be it's a reset hearing. So busy, busy week. I did a bunch of pre-hearing briefs and kept really, really pretty busy. And, as I'm always talking about, one of the big issues that I really stress with my clients is to be very, very specific about what they can do, what they can't do, that kind of thing. So that's something that's kind of an ongoing theme, and I'm really working on trying to figure out better ways to get that message across. I had one hearing this week, a very nice gentleman, and we'd gone over beforehand the importance of being very specific. How long can you walk? 10 minutes. How much can you lift? 5 pounds. What happens at the hearing? How long can you walk? Not very long. How much can you lift? Not too much at all. Not these days. It's just, and I kept having to try to pin him down into specifics. And, the judge was getting a little frustrated. So, things like that, just want to really try to avoid. And even in the forms that you fill out, make sure to be real specific. And that's just kind of an ongoing theme that I'm going to keep hammering home, because I think that's something that people do make mistakes with. So, okay, let's go to some of the questions here. We've got Hakasad, trust all is well. Yes, all is pretty well. We're supposed to get some really nasty weather here in Atlanta tomorrow. There's some sort of a crazy El Nino thing that it's going to dump a ton of rain and possibly some tornadoes here in Atlanta. So hopefully that won't happen, but it's going to be a wet day. We've had a very wet summer or late spring so far, and it seems to rain almost every day, which is frustrating because a lot of times I want to go play tennis or take the dog for a walk in the afternoon, and it's raining. So I'm hoping that we get more of a pattern where it doesn't rain every single day, maybe every couple of days. We need the rain, but not every single day. I mentioned before Judge Waltering out of Chicago in Elkins Park. Can you or Coffee provide an immediate decision? Generally speaking, and this is a good question, judges generally do not make a decision at the hearing. I'd say about 20% of the time, the judge will say, I'm going to find you disabled because you meet the grid rules, or I'm going to find you disabled because I think the medical evidence is really, really compelling. They don't normally do that, and there's a couple of reasons for that. One is, this is dating back to the time when we had live hearings. When the hearings were all live, the actual hearing offices were mostly in office buildings. Social Security is part of the executive branch of government. It is not judicial. So that means that Social Security has offices many times in commercial office buildings. And so, for example, the downtown Atlanta hearing office, you go in there, it's on the 5th floor of one of these buildings in Peachtree Center. And you go in there, and you walk in this room, and there's a big glass window, a big, floor to ceiling window. And you walk in there, and there might be seats for 75 people. And it could be, on back in the day, you might have 8 or 9 judges holding hearings in any one day. So you might have just, lots of people going through. And when you got back to the hearing room, it was basically in a small office. A small conference room is a better way to put it. Had a table, and it had a table in the front, like a T-shaped table. But it was not in any way secure. And there was no security. There was no bailiff or anything like that. Again, this is all administrative. And so I think that the Social Security decided that because it wasn't really safe necessarily for them to announce a decision, because imagine that, the claimant was a, 6'5", 350-pound former football player, and the judge says, I'm going to find you're not disabled. Well, the risk to the judge is this guy could get up and, rush the judge, or, even though they had security check for knives and guns, there was a safety factor. And, given that these judges were doing 8 or 9 hearings a day, inevitably there's going to be somebody who could be a danger to them. So what they decided to do was basically just tell people, we're not going to issue the decision right away. We will issue it, within the next few weeks or even a couple of months. And then beyond that, judges, I think, want to make sure there's nothing that surprises them. And I've had judges tell me that, many times when they're preparing for a hearing, they will look at the record maybe the weekend before or a few days before, scribble some notes and some initial thoughts, and then do the hearing. Then after the hearing, if it's a close case, they may want to dig into the medical record, or they send it off to a decision writer who is typically a staff attorney, usually somebody in a different location, geographically, different state. And the decision writer would go through the file and look for things as well. And for example, Spencer Bishens, who I think is going to be here next week or next week or two, he's a former decision writer. He'll tell us more about that. But he would say sometimes he'd look at the decisions and he'd call the judge up and say, I think you made a mistake, or would you consider this? So I think that they don't want to be pinned down to you're approved or you're denied when another look at the evidence might show something different. Or if there's a situation where a person has alcohol use or marijuana use, the judge has to make sure that there's not a substantial material factor to to this disability. So they don't want to get pinned down until they actually have the decision written. A long way about it is very rare that a judge is going to do that. Now, the cases where they do, the person's 62 years old, 4 herniated discs, 3 failed surgeries, cases that are really, really obvious, where some judges just feel like, okay, I'm just going to tell the person they've waited long enough. But I don't remember if Judge Woltering, I don't think he did, but I would not assume, even judges that sometimes don't always do that. They don't always give you a verbal decision. So I would tell you, it's more likely than not you're going to have to wait 3 or 4 weeks to get the written decision, and that's just the way they do it. And that's just, again, the process now. And they've told us, when occasionally they'll have these meetings with Social Security where the attorneys can go. Now it's done virtually, and they'll just say, this is how we're doing things. Tell your clients this. Tell your clients that don't expect to get a decision. It could be 4 or 6 weeks, because that's just the reality of how understaffed they are. So don't expect to get a decision. If you don't get one, is not a bad sign. It just means the judge, either by procedure, is not going to do it, or in that particular case feels like he or she needs to take another look at it. When do ALJs work on steps 1 through 4? I asked because the VE is scheduled for the hearing. How would they know if one is needed? Hakasa, that's a really, really smart question. So what he's talking about is when Social Security makes a decision, they use something called a 5-step sequential evaluation process. And basically that means that there's an analysis they've got to go through. Step 1 is, are you working or engaged in substantial gainful activity? Step 2 is, do you have a severe impairment? And severe basically means a diagnosed problem that is likely to cause some vocational issue. Doesn't mean it's disabling. It just means it's something that has to be considered thoroughly. Non-severe matters can be considered, but they're not going to be as looked at as closely. So I'll always put in my briefs that the person has non-severe impairments, which taken together would create some sort of an issue with work capacity. It might take them away from working around the general public, or it might take them away from working on unprotected heights, but it wouldn't do anything more than that. So step 1, are they working? Step 2, is it severe? And severe, long time ago, used to be anything. You could have a bad cold, it would be severe. Now it's got to be something, there's got to be a diagnosis, something that is, the doctors are saying there's something going on here. Step 3 of the sequential process, do you meet a listing? Website, meetalisting.com. If you want to look at the listings, very hard to meet. These are medical diagnoses that are usually life-limiting, very severe, not something you're going to recover from, and almost by definition are going to be work preclusive. So let me go. I've had that before. Oh, you know what I didn't do here? Give me 1 second. Let me just add this to my live stream here. What I'm doing here is I normally do this before and I forgot to do it, was put it on Instagram. Okay, so we are now on Instagram. And let's see if we can go live here. Okay, so anyway, step 3 is, do you meet a listing? Very difficult to meet a listing, but it does happen sometimes. Not usually at the hearing. That's usually something that's caught at the initial recon levels. Step 4 is, can you return to past relevant work? And that's something Social Security, is going to look at. Past relevant work, as you may know, is work you've done in the last 5 years, typically from the date of the hearing. If your date last insured is in the past, it's 5 years from the date last insured. For example, my hearing coming up next week, I've got one where my client's date last insured was December 31 of 2025. It means the look back is December 31 of 2020. His last day of work was November 30th of 2020. Therefore, he has no past relevant work for Social Security purposes. So, but past relevant work is that, you have to show that you cannot return to your past work. And then step 5 is, can you do any kind of work at all? And that's, where Social Security's got to prove that. It's step 4, 1 through 4, we've got to prove. Step 5, Social Security's got to prove there are jobs that exist. So Hakasad's question is, why would the judge schedule a vocational witness, which is typically a step 5, maybe step 4 situation, when he's not gone through steps 1 through 3 yet, or 1 through 4 yet? Well, the answer is most cases they're going to go to at least step 4. Most cases they're going to assume if the person's working, you're going to see it, and they would contact the attorney beforehand and say your client's working. Step 2, is it severe? Usually it's going to be considered severe, and realize the state agency, at initial and recon, has already made these determinations. So the state agency has decided the person is not currently working, has a severe impairment, doesn't meet a listing. Okay, step 4 is, can they return to past work? They may decide that they can. Usually they decide that either they can or there's no other jobs they could do. So the judge is assuming that most cases are going to go step 5. Now, interesting, I had a judge the other day make the point to my client that, every time Social Security holds a hearing, the cost to them is, I think, $1,500 or $2,500. So yeah, they are spending the government's money, but usually most cases end up at step 5 or step 4, where the vocational expert is necessary. And the problem, of course, would be if they didn't schedule a vocational witness, assuming that there's, not a severe impairment, the risk is that they get appealed and they got to go through it again, costing even more money. So the general frame of reference, or the general thought, is that they're going to assume that the vocational witness is going to testify. I would say, pardon me, about 90% of the case, 95% of the cases I try, there is a vocational expert witness. And I'd say of the cases where the vocational witness, and the ones that are not, by the way, are usually just like the person has terminal cancer. There's no need for it because it's very clear. And of the cases with vocational witnesses, which is most of them, I would say they testify at some degree in 98% of the time. So the judge is assuming the vocational witness will be testifying. Many times, for example, if the judge is going to find that the person could return to past relevant work, the judge will go through the exercise of also asking a very, mild hypothetical, one with very mild limitations, to show that they could do other work as well. So they could take their choice in denying the case, saying past work or there's no other work anyway. So that's why they have them. So the judge just assumes it's going to be there for testimony. The VE will be there for testimony, and they're usually right. That's usually what's going to happen. But because they haven't gone through steps 1 through 4, the state agency's already done it, so they kind of have an idea what's going to be going on with steps 1 through 4. And like I said, most cases are going to end up at step 4 or 5. I'd say 5% of the time, and these are judges that are usually just really low pay judges, will deny a case at step 2. There's one judge that I know that has denied several cases that I've seen at step 2. It's no severe impairments. And one time he did it on one of my cases. I got it remanded. He still denied it, but he got remanded saying, yes, that's a severe impairment. It was a mental health issue, but the guy had treatment and there was diagnosis. So it's really hard for a judge to say it's not severe, but some judges will do that. but most of the time, it's going to be a vocational witness will be testifying. Um, if there's no past work, no transferable, and can't do it, step 5 adjudication hypos are different. Well, again, the judge has discretion to give whatever hypos he or she wants. And even if you can't do past work or there is no past relevant work, the judge could pose a hypothetical. And realize that from the judge's perspective, they are being reviewed as well. So anytime a decision is issued, favorably or unfavorably for that matter, it is possible that the appeals council on its own could review the judge's analysis. And they want to make sure that the judge is considering the evidence appropriately. You might even say that the judge is considering the evidence in a light most favorable to the claimant, meaning that if a judge is going to deny the case, typically it'll say, even assuming the claimant is credible in this, even that we believe some of it, we still are finding him not disabled. It's very rare that you see a judge saying this person is completely full of what. They usually say we're going to find that they're that their symptoms can be reasonably be expected to arise from this condition, although not to the degree they said. And really, a lot of the hypos, in fact, will include limitations that are much less than what the reality is. For example, you have a person who, let's say, has carpal tunnel in both wrists and some shoulder issues, and the judge will say, assume he can lift 20 pounds. Well, he can't, obviously, in that situation, and testimony would back that up. But he'll say, even if he could lift 20 pounds, when you factor in he's not reliable, he'll be off task for 15% of the time, he'll be missing days from work. Even if he could lift 20 pounds, he's still disabled. So they will include in their hypothetical, capabilities way beyond what you could really do and still find you disabled by saying, let's assume, that things, we'll assume the client's got a lot more capacity than he's even saying. He's still disabled. So that's the way judges do it. So it's just, there's kind of a game to it, I guess you could say, in the way they create these hypotheticals. And of course, judges will create their hypotheticals ahead of time, as do I, before the hearing, because they kind of know what they're going to be talking about. And a lot of these hypotheticals contain, the same sort of limitations. No climbing ladders, ropes, and scaffolds. No kneeling, crouching, crawling, or stooping. Occasional handling and fingering. There's certain things that are just the same hypotheticals over and over and over. And then maybe 2 or 3 factors that would take it from, minimally minimal capacity to do some work to not being able to work at all. So the judges do, and I don't doubt at all that judges, if they look at the record, again, as do I, and they look and they kind of have a sense. Okay, you got a 57-year-old former construction worker who's had 2 back surgeries and needs a knee replacement. Okay, right there, if I was the judge, I'm thinking it's going to be really hard to assume this person's going to be able to go back to work. You got to find the rationale behind it, but just on the facts alone, it's pretty likely this person's not going to be very reliable at a job. By contrast, a 35-year-old with mild to moderate depression and mild carpal tunnel in the non-dominant left hand. Okay, if I'm the judge, I'm going to think, that's a real hard road to hoe. That's probably not going to be a disabling condition. They're supposed to listen and look at the evidence, and I suspect that every once in a while they're surprised by something in the evidence. But I'm guessing that most judges probably make their mind up, pretty quickly, either before the hearing or during the hearing, based mostly on the profile of the claimant. Again, if I was a judge, I would have in my mind certain profiles. Person 57 years old, construction background, bad back, probably going to get approved. A person 25 years old, mild depression, type 2 diabetes without insulin, probably not going to get approved. A good judge will have an open mind to say, okay, maybe the evidence will convince me, and 1 out of every 20 or 30 of those, might change their mind, but most of the time they're not going to do that. I would also tell you, when you look at the approval ratings of judges, some judges, are in the 60 or 70%. Some judges are the 20 or 30%. My experience has been, if you're over 55, even the 35% judges will often pay those cases, because those are the cases they're going to approve, the ones where they're older people with significant objective evidence supporting disability. they're not going to give much benefit of the doubt to the someone's in the middle, the 49-year-old with, let's say type 2 diabetes, insulin dependent, maybe some blood clotting issues, and a badly bulging disc, kind of on the edge. 65% judge approves that case, a 35% judge does not. And I think all judges are going to look really, really closely at the 25-year-old, unless there's something really, really severe. I mean, the way I look at it is if you're 25 or 30, the amount of evidence you've got to have is about 5 times as powerful. It's got to be 5 times as powerful as you would need if you were 55 or 58, something like that. So, the judges are going to do their hypos ahead of time, but I think they probably have in their mind a profile of what a deserving case looks like. And, a good judge will keep an open mind, but many of them, that's just what they do. And quite frankly, that's what, as attorneys, we do when we're looking at cases, because we only get paid if we win, obviously. So I'm looking at a case, and, if somebody can convince me that they are truly disabled and they're younger, I'll take that case. And I've got several right now of people in their 40s and one even in the 30s. Because I think it's really strong. But, you've got to make a tough decision. With the judge, it's a denial. With the attorney, it's you do 2 years worth of work and don't get paid for it. So again, got to be real careful about that sort of thing. Okay. Baxter Taylor, on my first denial, they limited to light unskilled work. Is that my record permanently? Again, a really smart question. And so what Baxter is asking is, and I'm not sure if you mean the first denial at the administrative level or at a hearing. We'll go over both. So let's say that you get an administrative denial at the initial application. You're denied, and the adjudicator limits you to light work, which again is standing and walking 6 hours a day, lifting 20 pounds frequently, 10 pounds on occasion. 20 pounds on occasion, 10 pounds frequently. And it's unskilled because of whatever, maybe mental health issue or medication side effects or pain. You're limited to light unskilled work, but because of your age or because of the past work you've done, you can either return to past work or there are light unskilled jobs out there that you could do. Okay, so is that binding on Social Security at a hearing? No. At a hearing, the judge will take a brand new look at it. The findings of the state agency are not binding at all. Are they relevant? Yes. And when I write my briefs, I will reference those findings and I will attack them. I had one the other day where the state agency found my client could return to past work. Past work was light. He could return to past work because he could lift 10 pounds frequently. 10 pounds occasionally. Well, light work is 20 pounds occasionally. So, it didn't even make sense internally. Had another one where they cited a job in the DOT, Dictionary of Occupational Titles, that does not exist. And there's some explanation for that, but, just stuff like that. You see kind of mistakes. I had a judge call me the other week who's like, I wrote a brief and I said the state agency is basically full of it. And she called me before the hearing. She said, just want you to know, you're absolutely right. The state agency, I'm going to give that no weight at all. And you wouldn't believe some of the stuff I see from them. So yeah, it's not binding at all. So at initial and recon, if the state agency makes findings, that's what they use to deny claims. And the judge might look at that, but is not bound by it in any way, shape, or form. They're meeting you, whereas the state agency did not. They have the benefit of a lot more evidence. There's an attorney presenting the case. It's a whole different ballgame. So they're not bound by that. So it'll be completely what they call de novo review. Now, let's say that Baxter is talking about a prior hearing denial. And in the hearing denial, the case was denied because the judge found that he could do light unskilled work and therefore was not disabled because there are light unskilled jobs out there. Is that binding? It depends. I think that you could make an argument, and if you would want to make this argument, if let's say you turn 55, okay? If you're 55 and you're light unskilled, then the grid rules, apply, assuming you have a physical limitation, which I would think if you have light unskilled, light would be the physical limitation. So you might want it to apply. And there's actually some doctrine out there, but it's not in every circuit, that says that Social Security is bound. They can't find you have more capacity than what they previously found at a hearing, unless the evidence is compelling. And that's the gotcha. So in theory, a judge could, let's say that you went to your first hearing, you were denied light unskilled because you're 53 years old, you appealed it, or you filed, forget the appeal, you filed a new application and your onset date is after your 55th birthday, um, can the judge now come back and say, well, you could really do medium work? Um, I think they can, but I think it's something where a judge is going to have to be pretty convincing to the appeals council that something significantly improved. Because again, the presumption is that a judge already made this decision 2 or 3 years ago. By definition, or logically, most people don't get better with age. In terms of their physical issues, if they've got ongoing problems. Sometimes they do, but a lot of times they don't. And so it's a hard argument for a judge to make. So it's going to be an important factor. In some circuits, it is basically assumed that you are going to be stuck with that light unskilled or that prior RFC unless you have compelling reasons otherwise. Other circuits, it's not in the case law, but judges are still going to be, I think it would be appealable if the judge didn't explain why he or she felt like you had gotten significantly better and your RFC, your residual functional capacity, was now medium instead of light, or now it's light and skilled or something like that. So it's in your file, but I don't think it's binding. At the initial and recon, it's not binding at all. At a prior hearing, it's evidence, and probably it's more not binding, but more relevant, and it could benefit you more at a subsequent hearing. I think that's just going to generally benefit you because, a judge could find you have less capacity, but to find that somebody who's 2 or 3 years older has more capacity is a really unlikely type of thing. Okay, Kevin Johnson, Grandpa Panda. Yes, I was Grandpa Panda today. I had my 3-month-old grandson who's starting to laugh a little bit and give you grins. And so I put him down for a nap in the morning, and he was screaming bloody murder. And I went upstairs and said, look, you got to just give me a break here. The screaming's got to stop. And so I patted him on his tush and, rolled him around a little bit. And he went to sleep, and he had good sleep. And then I took him to the park, met my wife and granddaughter at the park. She had a music class today, and he was sleeping. He's actually starting to sleep a little bit more because he was just sleeping for like 30 minutes, and then he would insist on being held. I'm like, man, I'm going to fly. So I had to feed him his bottle, and so it's coming along. And my granddaughter's very precocious and very opinionated, and running around like a crazy person. But we were my wife tonight when I got home. My wife, we just looked at each other. She's like, we're getting ready for another Wednesday, because Wednesdays are our day. It's like, wow, it's not like it was, 30 years ago when we were young parents. Now we're not quite as young, and these kids run us around. But yeah, we had a nice day. Thank you. Is it hard to get now? Trump wasting taxpayers' money. Funny of a second. Okay. All right. At this point, so the question really is, are we seeing any difference in terms of the difficulty of getting Social Security disability in the current administration with President Trump? Answer is there's really been no change at all. There was some talk about eliminating the grid rules, and that was floated back in December. And a lot of people, the AARP and other interest groups, howled, basically to say that's not going to fly. We're not going to go with that. And realize they're looking at it both, because there's a perception in Congress, and it's really both parties, but there's a perception in Congress that people are, it's too easy to get disability benefits. Not true, but that's the perception. So let's tighten it up. And then, of course, the bigger one is the money. The trust fund is going to run out of money in a few years, like 3 or 4 years now. And they're looking for ways to eliminate or to avoid raising taxes to deal with that. What will happen, in my opinion, and there's a lot of chatter about this, what's going to likely happen is, and I've read a couple of different possibilities, but one is they are going to have to raise the wage base. Right now, it's like $185,000. So the first $185,000 you pay Social Security taxes on. Beyond that, you don't. So you could have a person making $185,000 paying X, whatever percentage of Social Security taxes. You have a person making $5 million a year paying the exact same dollar figure of Social Security taxes. Now, why was that? I don't know. I mean, the only thing I can think is that the reality is, if you look at the actuarial tables, the person, making $5 million a year, if you taxed him on his full $5 million, he's not going to get anything close out of Social Security as to what he paid in. And there's a perception that's not fair. Obviously, some people are going to say, well, you're making $5 million, you should pay more. Again, it's easy to say if it's not your money. My point is that I think that's what kind of drove that. And again, there's all these bargains in Congress where they're trying to, trade off reducing taxes on farmers, for example. That's actually an interesting. I'm not going to go into detail about it, but one of the things that the tax laws always have to be very careful about is family farms, because many times farmers have assets worth millions of dollars, but they're illiquid and they can't sell them. And if you tax them on their assets that have not been liquidated, family farmers are going to go bankrupt, or they're going to lose their farms. And that's not a positive development for anybody. So a lot of bargaining going back and forth. But I think what's going to happen, if I had to guess, will be they will raise the income threshold for Social Security withholding maybe to $250,000. Then there'll be what they call a donut hole from 250 to, let's say, a million or $1.5 million or something like that, where people after, up until $1.5 million, let's say, they pay up until 250, and then, or whatever it may be, whatever number they come up with, they won't be paid the tax on the next $500,000, let's say. And then after that, they get taxed, the same percentage on their earnings over that. So it kind of creates a donut hole for people, especially those, let's say, who live in New York or California, where they make a lot of money objectively. They make, $250,000 or $300,000 a year, but the prices are so high there that that's equivalent to making $100,000 in, Iowa or Milwaukee or something like that. So, I think there's that kind of negotiation. It'll obviously depend on who's in power and who controls the Congress and who controls the presidency, but that's going to be one thing they're going to do. I think the second thing they're going to do is they're going to raise the retirement age. Right now, I think, if I'm not mistaken, it's 67 or 69 is, I don't know, I can't remember full retirement age. It'll be 71 or 72, something like that, where what that means is that you can't start collecting Social Security retirement until a later age. And so early retirement, maybe right now it's 62, maybe that'll turn into 65 or 66. Or if they keep it at 62, the percentage of money that you get compared to your full retirement age will be a lower percentage. Again, there's trade-offs. On one hand, if by doing that, what it does is it means there's potentially more money coming in for longer. And they can use those accounting tricks to talk about the solvency of this, and they can borrow more money based on these accounting tricks and the solvency of the system. The problem, of course, is if you make retirement age older, then you have more people in their late 60s and 70s that continue to work, which means that younger people coming in the workforce are going to have a harder time moving up the ladder. So, there's you've heard the expression, for every action, there's an equal and opposite reaction. I think that's the way with the tax code and some of these regulations, that whatever they do, it's going to cause impacts that are either nobody's expecting or haven't thought through, or that may be negative to the big picture. But if I had to guess, there'll be an increase in the wage base, and there will be a change in the retirement age. There's a lot of other possibilities, but those are the two I think that have most likely. And what it'll do is it'll basically push the problem down the road 10 more years. That's the way Congress says. They don't, this problem is so big to solve, because this money is so huge that in order to solve it, they would have to, make huge changes to the tax code, and there's no political will to do that. So it'll be a short-term fix, just long enough for the people in Congress now to be out of office and retired, and they can let the next guy deal with it. And then as far as the retirement age, if you're in your 40s or 30s, you're going to be paying for it. I think people in their 50s and 60s, they probably won't change much for those people. So that's my guess. We'll see. Okay. But at this point, by the way, there's not been any change in the grid rules. That would be a real problem if they did, but that has not happened. Okay. All right. I think we've already talked to that one. Um, okay. So Baxter filed the claim in 22, is 51, 55 now. Yes. So as of your 55th birthday, or really, if you do what they call non-mechanical application of the grid rules, say 54 years and 6 months or 8 months, something like that, they will consider you to be quote unquote 55, at which point, assuming you have physical limitations, the grid rules, the light grid rules, the 202 grid rules, and I mean, if you go to my website, gridrules.net, look up the light grids, the grid rules that apply when you're 55 will apply in your case as of your 55th or close to your 55th birthday. So, yes, that will benefit you in that regard. And I've had several situations where somebody comes to me, they were denied before, they want to refile. My first question is, what's changed? Why do you want to refile? And because I've gotten worse, whatever. But the big issue, the big factor is their age category changed. They went from being 49 to 52. Now the sedentary grids apply. They went from 53 to 55 in 6 months. Now the light grids apply. Much easier to win at 55 than it is at 53, and much easier to win at 53 than it is at 47 or 49. Okay. Health Reviews Plus. May I ask 2 questions? It's due in a week or 2. Okay. Well, you just ask 1. No, I'm just kidding. Yes, you can ask 2 questions. Happy to do that. Okay. Are CDRs still done when someone's 64? Jorge Torres says, theoretically they could be, but they're not. They're not going to do them. It's just, you're so close to retirement age. By the time you appealed it and then went to a hearing, you'd be at retirement age. So it's pretty not real likely. Bala 2001. Hello to everybody. Hello, Bala. I think I should have audio now. I think when I first went on, I was like running a little bit late today. Again, I had the grandkids, and then I had to, I had a salad, and I had to get the garbage cans up because it's going to rain tomorrow. And by the time I took a shower, by the time I get down there, it's like, wow. Then I had to do a brief. I wanted to get filed today, and with my formatting, what I do when I write a brief is it's usually like 6 or 7 pages. So I'll print the last page out so I can sign it, and then I print pages 1 through 5 to PDF, and then I combine them using a little utility. Well, for some reason, pages 1 through 5 gave me a blank page at the end. So I'm trying to figure out how to get rid of that blank page so I can just have 6 pages, not a blank page in the middle. And I'm looking at that, and time got away from me. So next time I look up, it's like, you're live. I'm like, oh, okay, I better get there. So, and I didn't turn the microphone on. Kathy Clayton says, good evening. Good evening, Kathy Clayton. Chantet says, thank you. Thank you, Chantet. Cynthia with an I. How are you doing, Cynthia? Mary Simmons says, good evening. How long does the appeals council take, says Sarah D. It can take anywhere from 3 to 4 months up to a year. I've had a few that are really quick, and sometimes it can take a year. It just depends on how busy they are. So that's what I can tell you. Okay, I already talked about that one. Difficult to continue. Okay. All right. Good evening. How long is it typical to move out of step 1 in the application? Receive confirmation they've received my application March 16th, and cricket since then. What may be happening is your case is what is called staging. And in some states, Texas, for example, Florida, it goes into staging, meaning the application is received by Social Security and it's basically sent over to the state agency for adjudication. They don't have any staff to do it, so it sits there waiting for an adjudicator. And it can sit there for, I had a case out of Texas, sat there for over a year. What I would tell you is Joel, I would say if after you did it in March, so now we're in June, March, April, May, June, 3 months. I would say give it another month if you want to, or you could do it now. Reach out to your U.S. senator, your congressperson, ideally your senator. Say, look, they acknowledge that they haven't done anything. It's been 3 or 4 months. Will you make an inquiry to find out what's going on? That will move things along. I'm guessing your case is in staging. Congressional inquiry gets it out of staging. M. Steele says, good evening. Lurker emerges and says, I'm a survivor of stage 4 glioblastoma, which is brain tumor, younger than typical recipient. I'm 37, I have lasting brain injury. Is my age likely? Well, it could be a couple of things. I think they don't deny just because of your age, but a younger person they presume is more resilient and can bounce back from things. Um, the issue is probably what are the limitations that arise from the glioblastoma? Do you have permanent, let's say, vision problems? Do you have what are the complications? Do you have, like, I have a friend who had a glioblastoma, had surgery, and it's the same person, but there's less of a filter. She'll say stuff that she never would have said before. Is that disabling? No, she's actually working. But it's different. Okay. Now, if you had a brain surgery and now you have foot drop on your left side, different story. So the real question here is, A, what are the functional issues that have arisen now that you are, past the crisis stage? Are you on medications that have side effects? What are the functional issues that arise from this history of this glioblastoma? That's really the question. So I don't know your age, and that is certainly a factor. They make it, they assume more resilience at a younger age. But the real question is, what does the medical record say about how this very traumatic experience impacts you in a functional way day to day at this point, or as of the onset date you claim? Joan Haig says, I was just denied for the second time requesting a hearing. The problem is I don't have a lot of medical records. The doctors they sent me to basically did nothing. Will be this test for arthritis. Well, I mean, again, don't rely on the Social Security consultative evaluations to build a medical record. That's not a good move. You need to have your own doctors, and really, an arthritis specialist, rheumatologist, possibly, a pain doctor, pain management doctor, a physiatrist, somebody like that. But you've got to have, what I find, because realize arthritis, osteoarthritis in particular, very common. Everybody has it at some level. Certainly after, say, 40, everybody's going to have it. Just like with mild depression or non-insulin dependent diabetes. These are really common conditions that Social Security is going to be reluctant to award benefits on. Okay. So I would say you've got to have a medical doctor to say that your experience of arthritis, wherever it is causing significant functional limitations in terms of standing and walking and sitting and lifting and bending and kneeling and crouching and crawling and stooping, or the pain level is severe enough to cause problems with focus and attention, concentration, persistence, and pace. Medications you're on causing negative side effects, or they're ineffective, or you can't take them because you've got kidney disease or something like that. But you've got to show why your experience with this somewhat common condition, arthritis, is different than the rest of the people out there who have arthritis who are filing for disability. It's got to be significant enough to keep you from working. And if you don't go to the doctor, Social Security assumes there's nothing much wrong with you and that it's mild and manageable. So unfortunately, you got to go to the doctor, your own doctor, and try different types of treatment and get the doctor, show in the medical record, the record will show you tried, physical therapy, that didn't work. You tried injections of some, if that's appropriate, that didn't really work. You've tried ice and heat, that didn't work. You've tried, chiropractic, that didn't work. You've tried, whatever else you've tried, nothing seems to have worked. And you're having these ongoing problems. And it's well documented. There's x-rays. Usually that'll show bony issues. Could be MRIs that show significant problems in arthritis in various parts of your body. So you have to have a very extensive medical record, in my view, if you're going to pursue a condition like arthritis or diabetes, that is, or mild depression, that is very, very common. Okay, so Luke is the person with glioblastoma, said that the person making the decision did not dig very far. You have imaging showing there's a large void in the brain. And the MRI was, difficult. They make their decision, might be able to work full time. You say they MRI images Now again, the MRI would typically be something you provided them. They're not going to usually pay for. Social Security is not going to pay for an MRI. Now let's look at what you said here, and again, I just want you to see how I'm looking at this. There's a large void. There's a empty space in the brain where maybe part of a tumor or something was removed. Does that make you disabled? I mean, and I'm not being facetious. I'm saying you're saying to me there is there's a, a a spot that used to have tissue doesn't have tissue anymore. Why is that disabling? You need to have a doctor to say that this is causing, this damage to your brain is causing problems with depth perception, is causing problems with vision or hearing or something like that. Simply having, it's just like if you came to me and say, I've got herniated disc at L5S1 and I've got bone on bone, or I have my knee shows torn meniscus and I've got carpal tunnel in my wrist and I've got, frozen shoulder. Are those disabling? Those are diagnoses. What is the functional issue? The frozen shoulder, does that mean you can't reach overhead? You can't carry something? Is it with your dominant, non-dominant arm? The carpal tunnel, is it severe carpal tunnel? Is it documented by, an EMG? Does it limit you from gripping? How much can you grip? If you could lift 10 pounds with the with wrists that are afflicted by carpal tunnel, you could type for 20 minutes at a time. That may not be disabling. So you're not disabled. Herniated disc. There are, people out there walking around with herniated discs that are minimally symptomatic. You may have a herniated disc, but it may not impact you unless you are running. And as long as you don't run, you're fine. I mean, look, I had back issues. I don't think I had a herniated disc, but I had some back issues and I would be fine except when I'd go play basketball. And I had the big brace and I had the this and the that and I'd stretch. But, if I played basketball and I fell or I ran too hard or I jumped and I came down the wrong way, I'd go into spasm. I'd be out of pocket for 2 weeks. But if I didn't play basketball, I'd go indefinitely and never have a problem. I play tennis now with the same back. I play tennis. I'll play 2.5, 3 hours. Doesn't bother me at all. I go and play basketball for 15 minutes. I'm hurting. So it just depends on the activities and how this impacts you in a work environment. That's really the key. So that the void in your brain is not disabling unless there are functional issues that go along with it. Okay, so Joan is 62. What to do? Denied requesting a hearing. Now, being 62, all right, you've got severe arthritis and numbness in your legs and your feet getting worse. Right there, that says to me two things. One is the grid rule. Go to gridrules.net, all right, and look at the grid rules under the light grids. And basically what those would say would be a person over age 55, who is limited to light work or less. And I would think that with, numbness in your legs and severe arthritis, it's pretty unlikely that a judge is going to say you could do medium work. So you're limited to light work or less. And if you've got significant pain, any skills that you may have acquired are going to be difficult to apply. I think it's a pretty good shot that you meet the grid rule. Look at 202.06 and 202.04 in particular. I think you get in front of the judge. I think that would be a pretty reasonable thing to consider. The second thing I want you to look at is, let me find this, the specific thing. This is something called the PALMS regulation. Let me share my screen so you can see it. And I'll put the link in the chat here. This is the link to the PALMS regulation. And I use this all the time, or when somebody's over 55 at least. Let's take a look here. Okay. So this is what they call the PALMS regulation. Let me make this a little bit bigger. And basically the PALMS stands for Program Operations Manual. And basically what we got here is it talks about transferability of skills and now how you analyze it. So if you go down a little bit, it says here that if you are age 60 or older, all right, if you can do light work, all right, even if you could do light work, let's see here, then they have what they call minimal vocational adjustment standard that applies. If you're age 55 and you're limited to sedentary work, then the limited vocational adjustment standard applies. Why is that important? Because when they're looking at transferability of skills, they're basically saying that a person over age 60, if you have skills, let's say you worked in a commercial plant nursery for years as a bookkeeper. Well, they're going to say that, if even though you've got skills as a bookkeeper, it's not going to readily transfer to another industry like, I don't know, let's say a sporting goods store or a medical practice. Yes, you're a bookkeeper and they're general principles, but you're in a completely different industry. They're not going to expect at age 60 for somebody to learn a completely new industry if you're limited to a light functional capacity, which means that you've got, pretty significant problems there. If you're limited to sedentary work, okay, and you're age 55, that minimal vocational adjustment standard applies as well. If you're age 55 and you're limited to light, doesn't apply. But you have to be 60 for that to apply. So a 61, 62-year-old person who's limited to light can reference the grid rule at 202.04 or 06 and the PALMS regulation to argue that they meet the grids in terms of their functional capacity and lack of and past work, and then they can reference the PALMS regulation to argue that the 25015.017 to say that any skills they may have had don't transfer. So you're in a much stronger position to be 62 with arthritic back or legs or whatever. As long as you're limited to light work, there's a pretty good chance you're going to get approved. That profile, remember I talked earlier about profile, that profile, a 62-year-old person with significant arthritis and numbness in their feet, that's a winner, in my view. That, to me, is a profile of a winner. So why they denied you early on, can't tell you. I think most judges are going to look at that. The first thing they're going to say is, how am I going to turn that person down? Can I really argue they could do medium work? Can I really argue that the skills you've got readily transfer to another industry? Probably not. So I think that's Joan, I think you've got a really, really, pretty good argument based on what you're telling me there. Forge Mill says, has lumbar stenosis. Stenosis is a narrowing of the space in the vertebra where the spinal cord goes, and it can cause pressure on the spinal cord. Bulging discs, not hernia, you say bulging discs at every level. Chronic venous insufficiency. That basically means that the blood flow, especially to the lower extremities, is compromised. That can cause cramping. It can cause swelling, might require you to keep your legs raised. Tricompartmental knee arthritis, which again is going to limit you from walking and standing. You have steroid injections every 3 months, which again is a somewhat invasive conservative treatment. Do I need to stop working before filing for disability? Yes. I mean, that's stage one of the 5-step sequential evaluation process. Are you working? Are you earning more than SGA? Maybe is a better way to put it. SGA is substantial gainful activity, $1,690 a month gross. So once and you don't say how old you are, if you're over 50 or even over 55, even better, you've got enough there, I think, to win. Does it mean you're going to win in 2 months or 3 months? No, it may take a year and a half to get to a hearing. But if you're 56 years old with this level of degree of problem, I think you've got a good shot. The question is, can you survive economically while you wait for them to do their thing? But I think, depending on your age, if you're 45, it's always a crapshoot because we don't know, what they're going to say at a 45-year-old. But even with these medical problems, but over 50 and especially over 55, good shot. But yeah, you got to stop working or make less than SGA. Okay. Should your lawyer rebut the vocational expert when they list the jobs you can do? Mine did not, even though my work restrictions would have affected me. I think he should have been the hearing. Well, here's the thing. The vocational witness is not your enemy. The judge asked the vocational witness a question and said, Mr. Vocational Witness, I want you to assume a hypothetical person identical in every way to Sarah here. This person is limited to a light functional capacity. Remember, standing and walking 6 hours a day, lifting 20 pounds occasionally. No climbing ladders, ropes, and scaffolds. no working around hazardous equipment or moving metal machinery, no working extremes of temperature. Are there jobs she could do? And the vocational witness comes up with 3 jobs. There's nothing to object to. That's the vocational witness is answering the question from the judge. Now, your lawyer could ask his own question or her own question and say, Mr. Vocational Witness, in addition to the limitations the judge just gave you, I want you to assume that our hypothetical person, i.e. Sarah, is off task for 15% of the day, or our hypothetical person is likely to miss 2 or more days of work per month, or our hypothetical person needs to take an unscheduled break to lie down every 45 minutes for 7 to 10 minutes, or our hypothetical person needs to use the restroom unscheduled 7 times a day, will be in the restroom for 7 to 10 minutes. Vocational witness will give you a different answer. So the vocational witness is not the problem. The problem is the question the judge asked. The jobs the vocational witness gave are legitimate based on the hypothetical. So there's nothing to object to there. And you can't object to the judge's question. You can ask your own. Now, the problem, of course, is that the judge is not obligated to accept your lawyer's question. Judge can use his own hypothetical. And there are some judges, one I'm thinking of in particular who I don't really like, he asked one question of the vocational witness. Usually it's one that, light RFC, no climbing ladders, ropes, and scaffolds, and off task 5% of the day. Well, the answer is always going to be there are jobs this person can do. And then your witness, and I'll ask a question 15%, or I'll ask 5 or 6 more questions. Doesn't matter. The judge is going to use my question. But it's not the problem of your lawyer didn't make a mistake. The problem is that the judge's question was not restrictive enough. Now, should your lawyer have asked an additional question? Yes. Or the other thing your lawyer could have done would be, if the vocational witness identified jobs as being unskilled, there is a line of questioning where you can argue that many jobs that are in the DOT, the Dictionary of Occupational Titles, that were described as unskilled are in fact skilled or semi-skilled. I always give the example of the copy machine operator. Back when the DOT was last updated in 1990, you go to a copy machine, you slap a piece of paper, hit a button, take the copy and bring it back to where you got to bring it back to. Now, you put the piece of paper on the copier, you scan it, you go to a computer, you download the file, you rename it, and you put it in a directory. That's not unskilled work. Okay. And so it's described as being unskilled, but it's not unskilled. And so you can ask the vocational witness, isn't it true that this job has changed dramatically since the DOT was last updated? Or isn't it true that a certain percentage of the jobs that you're describing here are part-time jobs? They're not full-time jobs. There are. I mean, there's one attorney that I know, and he wrote an article, very interesting article, and he talked about. I think it was Brian Konoski in a recent email. Brian's he's been on here before, and Brian is a appellate lawyer, and I think he was referring to records clerk as a job that is a lot of times referred to by vocational witnesses. Well, if you look at the DOT, it talks about microfilm and microfiche, which, for those of you not old enough to know what that is, before things were heavily computerized, what libraries and people saving documents would do is they would take an image, like a photograph of a document, reduce it down really, really small, and store it like on a piece of film. And if you want to look at the document, you go get that piece of film, you stick it in a machine, and it blows back up. And so that way, instead of keeping lots of paper, you could keep it on these sort of like cards. They look like 3x5 cards. If you're not sure, just look up microfiche online. You'll see what they look like. Well, as a practical matter, there's no microfiche anymore. I mean, computer storage is basically almost free, and so anything needs to be stored can be stored as a PDF. You don't need microfiche anymore. So the DOT talks about a record keeper, whatever, as including microfilm and microfiche and all this other stuff. And so Brian's point was, ask the vocational witness, the numbers you're giving us of the number of jobs, does this refer to, jobs of people that are, they're doing what are these jobs? Are these microfiche jobs? How is this definition changed? Or isn't the tasks of this job, microfiche was one type of thing, going to a machine and operating 5 or 6 different steps, aren't a percentage of those jobs semi-skilled is what it really boiled down to. And aren't a percentage of those jobs no longer in existence because there's no more microfiche. So you can challenge the VE on the numbers or the methodology. I had a VE the other day, and the judge says, and it was a winning case, I didn't really make a big deal about it. Judge says, what is the methodology used? What resources did you use? She goes, well, I used the DOT. Well, there's a ruling that came out a couple of years ago that says the vocational witnesses need to identify their sources, and the DOT alone ain't enough, because it's last updated in 1980. They're supposed to look at there's Job Browser Pro, which is a computer program, or the SOC codes. There's all these different resources now that can be used. Well, this vocational witness, I use the DOT. Had we been losing, I would have said, well, the DOT was last updated in 1980. And that's what you use. How can you expect, how do you explain, or how do you give us accurate numbers for a resource that is 40 something years old, 45 years old? Isn't it true that the definitions of, more than half the jobs in the DOT have changed dramatically, and a percentage of those jobs no longer exist? And this is the resource you're relying on. Or you could do that in a post-hearing brief, or do it on appeal. So again, there's lots of ways to do it, but I think just objecting to the vocational witness's answer on the grounds that, well, that's not what the evidence says, that's not the point. The judge gave a hypothetical, and the vocational witness is responding to the hypothetical. Forge says, thank you for helping us. My pleasure. Happy to do it. Chloe, what should you do before applying that nobody talks about? I think that when you are sitting down to apply for benefits, the first thing I would do is make a list of all of your doctors that you have treated with currently and going back a year prior to the date you say you became disabled, because you want to have that medical history. That's what Social Security is going to need. You're going to need that. The names, addresses, phone numbers of those doctors. And to be even more specific, if you can contact the doctor's offices and ask for the address that someone requesting medical records can use, that will ensure, or more ensure, that the adjudicator can get those records. So I think having a list of all your doctors is really important. Second thing is make a list of all of the medical issues that impact your capacity for work, and then order them in the things that are most significant, with an emphasis on those conditions with objective evidence behind it. So let's say, for example, you've got, a bad back, and you're also dealing with severe anxiety. Well, the bad back, there's going to be an MRI, or there's going to be an X-ray, there's going to be some objective test. That, in my opinion, is a stronger argument than anxiety, because anxiety you can't take an image of. So I would put in the list of problems, I'd put the back problem first, unless the anxiety has caused inpatient hospitalizations or suicide attempts or something showing really, really severe. But I think you need to make a list of the things that, based on how they impact you in a work environment. Let's say that you put on there, I had burn scars on my hands. Well, that may be unsightly. It's not going to create vocational issues for the most part. Maybe it eliminates you from being a hand model or certain public-facing type of things, but it's not going to eliminate you from doing a lot of jobs unless there's problems in terms of moving your hand. So I think you need to be realistic with yourself about the nature of the medical problems and how they impact you at work. So that would be a second thing I would look at doing. Third thing would be, I would get your My Social Security Statement, go to ssa.gov/my account, download your My Social Security Statement to make sure you have enough credits for SSDI, if that's what you're going to do, because you don't want to go into the disability world and find out you're an SSI only, don't have enough credits for SSDI, and your SSI would be offset by your spouse's earnings. So you want to make sure, and also it's good to know how much you're going to get. If it's $900 a month, you may decide it's not worth pursuing because that's not going to be enough to support you. If it's $3,500 a month, you may say, okay, I can live with that better. Um, I think the next thing I would look at would be consider your age. I talk to people sometimes that are 48, 47, 48, and I'm going to say to them, look, you know, you file for disability, maybe you win. However, your case is going to be much stronger when you're over 50. So sometimes, or if they're 49, they're thinking, or 48, they're thinking about applying, say, look, what's going to happen is you're going to apply, you're going to wait, and you're going to get to a hearing, and you may be 50 years and 2 months. And the judge may approve you as of your 50th birthday. So you might want to just keep working at this point until you get 50, hit 50, and that way, your chance that's probably when you're going to get approved. And so, that makes more sense to try to keep working if you possibly can. Another point I would tell you is if you have use of alcohol or street drugs and it's in your record, you've got to get clean. Judges, they get real squirrely when they see a lot of substance abuse. And again, if it's a material contributing factor to your disability, they'll deny you on that basis. So if you've had a problem with alcohol use or drug use, unless there's permanent damage, let's say you're in the liver transplant list or something, if it's something that you can stop, even let's say you've had alcohol issues and you're quote unquote a social drinker now, you got to stop. You got to go to a 5-step program or whatever the AA would be. So I think if that's the situation, you gotta really think about that and really go for treatment to show that you're clean. Another thing would be if somebody mentioned this before, don't have a lot of medical evidence. Well, Social Security assumes you're not going to the doctor. There's nothing wrong with you. So you may have a severe problem, but if you don't have a doctor's record, treatment from doctor, you're not going to win. So you need to establish a medical record, create a paper trail, go to the doctor on a regular basis, and make sure your complaints of limitations are clearly in the record. If the doctors, and here's sort of a sub-tip of that, download your records, go to the portal, download the records, see what they say. If the doctor is not reporting what you've told them, put a letter together, email it or mail it to the doctor and say, I looked at the records. You didn't mention my bad left knee. You didn't mention that the pain in my lower back is excruciating, at least 3 hours a day. If sometimes doctors minimize the problem in their reports, or they don't change what they say about your history over time. So you got to be an active advocate for yourself and just, correct the doctor politely, but correct the doctor. So those are a few things I would tell you that you want to do just in preparation, because again, this is going to be a long process, couple of years, probably 18 months, 2 years. And, it could be a fight. You may get in front of a judge who doesn't want to approve cases, and you got to have the evidence. And evidence is really, really key, especially objective evidence, MRI, CT, ultrasound, things like that. So if you have a condition that is, EMG, nerve conduction study, if you have a condition, let's say you have carpal tunnel, you don't have an EMG or nerve conduction study, very hard to win on that because judges expect to see certain tests for certain conditions. So that's sort of the big picture thing I would look at, is just get yourself prepared by making sure you've got everything kind of lined up that you're going to need, from the addresses of the doctors to the medical tests that have confirmed the problem you've got. And last thing I'll say would be, if at all possible, get treatment from a specialist as opposed to your family doctor. Carries more weight. You go to an endocrinologist for your diabetes, more significant going to your family doctor. So that's just the reality of it. Maybe it's not fair, it's not right, but that's just the reality of it. So those are things I would think about. Let's see. Health Review Plus says, so I report that I cannot take psych medicines at all, or any of the medicines on the Benzo Coalition's list, because I ended up in protracted withdrawal, which is not a recognized thing, although 20% get it. Okay. Yeah, I think that I would probably put on a form SSA 795 a statement to the effect of, to whom it may concern, or dear Social Security, wanted to advise you that, if when looking at my medical record or my medications list, you may note that I'm not taking, doctors would not prescribe me any medications on the Benzo Coalition list. And you may want to explain what that is. And the reason for that is that I have a condition where I am subjected to protracted withdrawal. And you explain what that is. And based on my doctor's advice, I do not take these medications because of the effects it has on me, not because I'm trying to be non-compliant, but because of these significant impacts that it has on me. I think that's enough. That way, it's in the file. The real key here is to show you're not being non-compliant. You don't want to be, well, I didn't do what the doctor told me to do. There's a reason. You can state the reason. I think that's how I would probably do it. And of course, tell your doctor to reference it as well. What record should I keep that most people throw away? I would say, one thing that I find helpful sometimes is employment records. If you've gotten write-ups from your employer because of absences or poor behavior or poor attendance or poor performance, that can help complete the picture of a person really struggling at work. You can also get statements from former coworkers and supervisors, but sometimes things like that, documentation from your employer that you were having problems could be something that could be of value to you. I think certainly I've had people tell me they get their denial notice from Social Security, the initial or recon denial, and they get so upset they just ball it up and throw it away. Well, that's not smart because A, you need to know the date on it, and B, you need to know the case number. So you want to keep everything you got from Social Security, no matter if it makes you angry reading it, you got to keep all that stuff. So I think those would be a couple of things you definitely want to keep. There's some question about should you have like old records, let's say surgical notes from 10 years ago. Social Security is not going to ask for it. And usually it's going to be in the record that you had surgery 10 years ago. You could testify about that. But, if it's a really invasive surgery, 3-level fusion or something you had an infection, post-operative infection, no harm in submitting that. I think that especially if there's long-term repercussions of that, maybe you can't take certain medications or maybe you have scar tissue formed. And this is just that more evidence of proof. I think that, judges, in my view, they recognize that when you've had multiple surgeries, let's say in your back or your neck, scar tissue is going to form. And, the second surgery may not be as effective as the first because they're having to deal with, existing, I guess scar tissue or existing, rods and pins or things like that. So I think that, sometimes evidence of prior surgeries can be useful. But I think education records can be another thing. If you've got, if you're claiming depression, anxiety, going back to childhood, and you've got education records showing you were getting psychological treatment, that can show the longevity of your problems. So those are a few things when I go for older stuff that, maybe most people wouldn't necessarily get. It just helps complete the picture. Realize you're painting a picture of a person, and the way you ought to look at this would be you're painting a picture of an honest, honorable person who is filing disability because you have no choice. You don't want to file for disability, but you have no choice. And you'll go back to work as soon as you possibly can. And here's the picture. Here's what I'm all about. I've had these prior surgeries. I've tried these prior medications. I'm allergic or I can't take these certain medications. And I've had these problems since childhood. Here's my school records. And I was having problems at work. Here's my employment records. It's all making the picture that much more complete. And yes, you can talk about these things, but having it in black and white, I think can be very, very compelling. Thank you. Yes. Well, I'm welcome. Thanks for coming by. I'm glad to see you. Is 455, that's the continuing disability review. I think that's the long form. Let me just double check. As I say, 455. That's the short form. I'm sorry. Not to send to everybody. I mean, they send it. They're sending the 454 is the long form. The 455 is the short form. They send out more short forms and long forms, but it's going to be sent to you based on, if you're coded as being likely to have improvement, then you're likely to get one. There's some randomness to it. You may get one there, but not everybody gets them. And again, a lot of my clients are over 55. They never see them at all. what's the biggest SSDI mistake people don't discover until it's too late? Um, well, I think, one thing that when you say it's too late is if you've not gone to the doctor. So let's say you allege an onset date of October of 2023, but you haven't gotten an MRI until December of 2024, and you really didn't start getting treatment until September of 2024. If you've got this gap between the time you stopped working and the time you started going to the doctor, many judges are going to say, well, how do we know you were disabled? I mean, I responded to a person today, and the issue was she wrote to me and said, I just found out I'm getting laid off, and I need to file for disability and retirement, I think, but she needed to file for disability. And so my response is, and that's fine, you can do that. I said, but Social Security is going to say, well, why did you wait until you were laid off? You didn't stop before then. What's to say if you hadn't gotten laid off, you would have been able to work another 6 months. So sometimes it can be more persuasive to have a gap between the time you stop working, if you're laid off in particular, and the time you file for disability. It's always good to have contemporaneous medical records. I think I've had a couple of cases over the years where the person claimed an onset date and didn't go to the doctor for 6 or 8 or 10 months after that. The judge changed the onset date to the first doctor visit because, again, Social Security assumes not going to the doctor, nothing wrong with you. So, if you're thinking about filing for disability, you haven't been to the doctor in a while, get to the doctor ASAP because you got to have some contemporaneous records. So I think that's a big one. Another one, which is really not a medical issue so much as you file before you realize you don't have enough credits. There are people out there who, you can get up to 4 credits in a year, depending on your earnings. And I've seen situations where you have to have, for most SSDI cases, you have to have 20 credits in the last 40 quarters, or 5 out of 10 years. Well, let's say you have 19 credits and you file. Well, all you need to do is go to work and earn like $2,000 and you get that extra credit. And now you're insured. So you go from being SSI, which maybe is offset and no SSDI, to SSDI by working another month or two. So, knowing your status as to whether you're insured or not can be really, really important. That's why I tell everybody, get your My Social Security statement. And if it says you're not insured, talk to a lawyer to do the manual calculations. Unfortunately, it's kind of hard. It's not obvious how to do it, but I can look at it and see, kind of guesstimate when they were last insured. And so I'm going to say, look, do we have evidence going back to, third quarter of 2023? That's when you were last insured. And if not, you need to get to work and at least get those extra credits. It gets a little tricky because, failed work attempt, you can still get credits for, but sometimes getting that extra, $4,000 or $5,000 of earnings can get you those, maybe extra 3 or 4 credits that can make a huge difference in your insured status. So those are the couple of things I think that are really big mistakes that people make just by not knowing stuff and proceeding. And I'll give you one more. If you have workers' compensation and you're collecting workers' compensation weekly benefits, that's going to offset your SSDI. And so, if you file for Social Security and you're getting workers' compensation, you're potentially creating a real problem. A, you're not going to see any past due benefits. B, it's going to create a problem with Medicare because Medicare doesn't want to get stuck paying medical bills from work-related accidents, as part of a Medicare. So there are a lot of times they're going to tell you have to wait before filing. So I would not just knee-jerk file for disability when you have workers' compensation without talking to both your comp lawyer and a Social Security lawyer, because sometimes you might want to hold off. I've seen literally stipulations in comp cases that say, I agree not to file for Social Security for 36 months or 39 months. That's so that Medicare can figure that you're going to use up your Medicare set-aside money. So I would say, don't file for Social Security if you're in the middle of a workers' compensation case without talking to your comp lawyer and Social Security attorney, both. Those would be a few things that just jump out at me as being big mistakes. Tammy Walker, you have a hearing date in September. My recount analysis, I can't remember previous work. Well, the judge honored that. So what Tammy's saying is that at the recon denial, the state agency said she cannot do her past work. That's helpful. The judge is not bound by that. Um, it's pretty unusual for a judge to find that the state agency decided you could not do past work, and the judge decides that you could, but he's not bound. He or she is, excuse me, not bound by that. So it's helpful, and that again now takes you out of stage 4, step 4 of the 5-step, pardon me, sequential process. Now you go to step 5, but I would still be prepared to prove that you cannot do your past relevant work. Like when I do my briefs, even if the state agency has said can't go back to being a firefighter, I still make an argument as to that they can't do past relevant work. So I think you still need to deal with that. One other point, let me just throw at you, Tammy, is going forward, now you've requested a hearing, you and or your lawyer need to make sure the medical record is updated. Social Security won't do it anymore. So just be aware of that. Be aware of that. And I would also say this is a good time to start thinking about the arguments you're going to use. Most people are going to use a grid rule argument if they're over 50 and have physical limitations, or a functional capacity argument. But, it's always good to start thinking about, how you're going to prove and to get in the mindset of proving that you are not able to do any kind of work at all because of your symptoms, and maybe keep a symptom diary. That would be, something that could be helpful as well, just so you've got that. And that's actually a really useful tool. And what I mean by symptom diary, it could be a drugstore calendar where you write down, had severe pain today, was in bed. Think about it. Can you tell me what you had for lunch on June 15th, 2024? No, nobody can. But if you have a symptom diary and you got a calendar going back to that, you can look back and say, oh, that day I had a really bad day. Well, you can put all that stuff into AI, let's say, it'll create a nice graph for you and show you how many days a week or a month you were having pain at level 8 or 9. Submit that document. That's evidence. A lot more compelling than you saying, well, I think I was pretty bad off back in 2024 and I stopped working. You got evidence contemporaneous that we made that you wrote down at that time. Very powerful. So that's something that maybe that falls into something that you don't realize until too late that you should have done, but that's a good thing to do, even at any point, just to keep a symptom diary. Okay, ENS says, I got approved. May 15th, my payment's been sitting in Baltimore. How does it normally take to get my process, to get my back pay first? I think you meant first payment. Something, obviously, that shouldn't take that long. It's going to be hard for you to reach out to Baltimore, which is the payment center. This is where you contact your congressperson and say, Senator so-and-so, I got approved. The money's being tied up. Can you make a phone call? And that money will magically appear. That's what I would do. Do we know the current, April says, do we know the current timeframes for SSA to re-review your cases after approval? ALJ recommended 12 months and then 18. I haven't heard anything. That's because of the staff shortage. It's going to come. If you had a 12-month review, it's going to come. It could be within, there's no telling when. It could be within 24 months, but I would be prepared for it. Just keep going to the doctor, keep your symptom journal if you can. It's going to come. But it should have been before then, but don't complain. It hasn't been. But I would tell you one other thing. Check your My Social Security portal periodically, just to see if there's anything in there that suggests they did send you something and that you didn't get it. That happens more often than you think. And if you check your portal, there could be information there that could help you. People with arthritis wish it wouldn't rain. I hear you. I've had many people tell me they can tell when a storm is coming. They can tell when a low pressure system's coming. Yeah, I don't doubt it. I don't doubt it at all. And believe it or not, in a Social Security case, I can argue it's not a winning, necessarily going to win a case, but a person, if they've got arthritis to the point where they feel it when the weather changes, person needs to avoid working outdoors, or this person is more likely to miss days because it rains. I'm in Seattle and it rains all the time, and rainy days are more painful. I have more episodes of spikes of pain when it rains. And, that can be a little bit of evidence. It's not going to overwhelm anybody, but it's there, that you feel really bad when the weather changes, when it rains. And, your pain level maybe shoots up to the point where you couldn't do a skilled job. So maybe you carve out skilled jobs. Now you can, in semi-skilled or unskilled. So it can help a little bit, believe it or not. Would an active workers' comp affect the ALJ's decision? Probably not affect the ALJ's decision. I mean, because you're not getting paid for work. It's just you're not going to see any money because the Social Security is going to be offset by workers' comp. So if you're getting comp benefits and you're try to collect Social Security, they're going to basically offset it and you won't see any money. So it doesn't matter to the judge. It's just you're not going to see any money because of the underlying process. Madeline of my office. Good evening, Madeline. Hope you're doing well. Older people advising me a suggestion. I read a letter to our senator about my situation. I think you were the one with the brain issue, if I'm not mistaken, right? Yeah, again, a senator is not going to put their thumb on the scale to get you approved. I don't think it's ever a bad idea to have Social Security know that a U.S. senator is kind of looking at what they're doing. But the senator's office is going to tell you, we cannot influence Social Security to approve your case. We can just ask them for the status and to ask them to move it along. So, complaining that they didn't make the right decision, that's what you appeal administratively on. But senators are usually good for getting funds unstuck or getting cases moving along that have not been moved in a while. Not so much about substantive issues. DG says, I was diagnosed with a traumatic brain injury after a serious head injury, was retired on total disability. I have neurological testing showing significant impairment, also an RFC from my doctor, RFC being functional capacity form. Hearing is July 29th. How impactful are those documents? Worked for 29 years, was a senior leader, HR leader, I'm on document, 56 years old. I think those documents are the neurological testing, maybe a neuropsych evaluation, and the RFC or the functional capacity. I don't call them RFC forms because RFC is a legal term, residual functional capacity. FCE forms, functional capacity evaluation forms, are the appropriate name for that document. But either way, those two things, the neuropsych eval and the FCE forms, very, very compelling. Helps a lot, can make a huge difference whether you win or not. Being 56, makes a big difference. You're probably 55 or close to it at onset. I think, and you've got significant problems, long work history. Those are all things adding up dramatically in your favor, in my opinion. Big Todd, you mentioned Carl Osterhout for his expert in appeals. Lindsay is representing your federal appeals, so I was hoping you feel the same about her. Yes, Lindsay is Carl's ex-wife. They still work together. Lindsay's a good friend of mine. I'm friendly with Carl too, but actually I probably talk to Lindsay more often than Carl. Very, very smart attorney, really, really sharp. I know that their firm, they do a lot of federal appeals work. In fact, I serve as local counsel for them for cases in the Northern District of Georgia, which means that they will file using me as the local counsel. I did one today, as a matter of fact. So I'm in touch with them a good bit. They are top-notch. Osterhout-Berger, top-notch. And so you are in great hands with Lindsay or Carl. They have the resources, the know-how, the experience. They are really, really, really good. I've done work with them for a long, long time. I've had Lindsay on my live stream before. I've had Carl on the live stream before as well. I think the world of them. I think they're just excellent attorneys. And that's the nice thing about this practice area. There's some really, really smart attorneys who are willing to share what they know. Osterhout-Berger, top-notch people. Brian Konoski, I met Brian in New York a few weeks ago. Shares a ton of stuff. There's just a bunch of people out there that just are constantly sharing information about what they know. So, you find somebody who's done this for a while, who's experienced in it, more likely than not, they will, they're not only share what they know, but they'll reach out for help. I mean, I'll tell you, there are times I'll have interesting questions that nobody has an answer to. We do have a listserv from through NOSCR, which you can ask questions and get answers to. But I'll pick up the phone and call, Lindsay, or I'll call Carl and say, what do you think about this? How would you deal with this? And they're always willing to help. So yeah, this is a nice practice area that people are very willing to help, and they're very friendly. And the goal, of course, of everybody who does this is to win cases. And, we all have the same goal. And so everybody's trying to help each other to do that. And if there's somebody comes up with a technique that works, they'll share it. But yeah, you're in good hands with Lindsay. She's great. She's great. Nice person too. What is the process of Form 455 after they receive it back? That's the short form. It's like a reconsideration or an initial application, probably is a better way to put it. They just look at it as if they were looking at your case brand new. They develop the record, they send it to a medical expert, and the question is this person still, their medical issues still enough to keep them where they're still not able to work? And that's what that is. So it's kind of like the same that the state agency would do an initial or a recon. Now, the one difference is that just a few weeks ago, all the CDRs are being centralized. It's not being done at the state level. It's being done at the federal level. So there's an office now that does the CDRs. And in the past, it would be the state would do it. Like if you live in Kansas, the Kansas, adjudicating office would do it. Now it's a federal office. We don't know what that means in terms of, does it mean more people are going to get terminated? We don't know. So it's too early to tell. It's just been a few weeks, but that's just something to keep an eye on. Jay for president. My attorney was garbage. I got denied 4 times up to the appeals council. I filed a new application with an Oscar attorney. Is SSA going to look at my past denial? Medical records were missing. Could they possibly reopen my last case? ALJ used missing records. All right. So big picture here is it's really, really, really unlikely they're going to reopen your prior case. I mean, you got to show, I don't know what even you have to show, but I just think that's just really unlikely. I would think you're going to have to show that there was some, significant error on Social Security's part. And, saying a judge cherry-picked the record, that's probably not going to be enough. Most of the time, if you have a prior unfavorable decision and you lost the appeal and you didn't take it further, or couldn't take it any further, then your onset date for your new case is going to be the day after the prior unfavorable hearing decision. So you're probably not going to get those benefits going back to the original onset date from case number 1. It's probably going to be, the new onset date from case number 2. There's probably not much you can really do about it. Secondly is judges are random, and you get a judge with a 35% approval rate or a 25% approval rate, bad luck. Nothing you can really do about that. In fact, you'll probably get that judge again unless the judge is retired or you've moved. So it does, it's a struggle. And again, unless your age has changed or something has changed medically, you're going to have an uphill battle with this second case. Again, somebody may look at it and say, now you're 55 when you were 54, going to make it easier because now we have the grid rule that, 55 grid rule that applies, or you've got a new condition and now we have something different. So that's what I would tell you. Let me just make one final comment. I get sometimes emails from people and they say, my attorney was garbage. My attorney sucked, didn't know what he was doing. I would avoid saying stuff like that because quite honestly, when I'm looking at that, if I'm as an attorney, if I get somebody, who got an unfavorable decision, and they happen, and yeah, is it possible the attorney didn't do a great job? It's possible. But the first thing I'm thinking is, a lot of times it's the case. I mean, I've said this before, the whether you win a disability case is mostly the evidence. A poorly prepared attorney can get a judge upset, and yes, that can make a difference. But for the most part, if the evidence is really compelling, let's put it this way, if you have compelling evidence, there's MRIs in there, and there's CTs and ultrasounds and all that kind of things showing significant problems, even if the lawyer doesn't have a clue what he's doing, the judge is still obligated to look at the evidence. So a lot of times the reason you lose is because the evidence isn't very good or wasn't compelling enough. Now, is it possible that the attorney didn't get evidence after the hearing was requested, or didn't get evidence that was there that should have been gotten? That is certainly possible. I just think my point here is that, in law school, let y'all in a little secret. In law school, one of the courses you take courses about ethics and professionalism. And one of the things that is discussed there is avoiding bar complaints and avoiding complaints, now social media complaints, things like that. And the first thing they tell you is, if you talk to a client who badmouths a prior attorney, think twice about taking that client. Because if they badmouth the other attorney and you don't get a good result for them, they're going to badmouth you. And it may not be your fault. You may have done an excellent job. So I just, anybody who comes in and I get a case inquiry, and the first thing I see is my prior attorney was a so-and-so. And sometimes I know the prior attorney and they're not a bad attorney. I may not take that case because I don't need the headache. So just keep that in mind. I think I would be, it could be the other attorney screwed up, and I'm not saying it's not possible. I'm just saying a lot of times it's the medical evidence isn't compelling enough, or you had a bad judge. There could be a lot of reasons you didn't get a favorable decision. And some of them may have to do with the attorney, but some of them may not. But I'm just telling you that many attorneys, and I kind of count myself in this group, I'm reluctant to take a case if somebody's bad-mouthing a prior attorney because, they may have unrealistic expectations. I'll just leave it at that. But that's my take on that. Okay, I think, Chloe, I've already answered that question. All right, Jay, you were 26 years old, CRPS, which is, chronic pain syndrome. Being 26 is a real problem, even though you're bedridden. I'm not doubting what you're going through. 26 makes it really, really hard, really, really hard. So that may have something more to do with it than your attorney, quite frankly. How did they get around age discrimination from the grid rules? Asking someone 37 years old with severe brain injury. I don't think it's age discrimination. I think they're looking at it as, they recognize that people over age 50 and over 55 are going to have more trouble in the work environment. In the law, and again, I'm just going to give you very general, thoughts about how the law looks at categorizing people by age or whatever category. If there's different, and this, again, brings me back to law school, there are different standards for when you can do that. Sometimes the government has to have a compelling interest. Sometimes it's got to be, rational. There's like 4 or 5 different levels of standard. And, if it's something where it's not based on, if they based it on race, if they said African-American applicants, these rules apply to them, but not to, Asian Americans, that's not going to stand past muster. But, based on age, if there is a rational reason to do it, and the rational, compelling reason to do it is that, statistically, and there's evidence to show this, that people over 50 have a more difficult time re-entering the workforce, there is a rational reason to do that. And is it possible in the past somebody has sued the government on the grounds that this was discriminatory? It's possible, but I'm guessing it got thrown out, or it was decided that was the government met its burden on that. So that's my answer, is it probably is one of those categories that there is objective evidence to show not so much that people under 50 are less disabled, but that people over 50 are going to have a more difficult time re-entering the workforce. And given that we are dealing with a program that evaluates disability based on, work capacity and work availability, because realize that the VE is talking about jobs that exist in significant number in the national economy. So age is a factor there, as is education. Okay, that's another factor. They can use it. So I think that's why they're allowed to use it. Okay, Kathy Clayton. If you're approved for SSDI and pass before your back payment, does the money go to your estate? No, it does go to your estate. It goes to the next surviving kin. I had a case earlier, it was late last year, early this year, I can't remember. I think it was late last year, where my client, we filed an application for her, went through the recon, and then before the hearing, she died. And so her son appeared with me at the hearing virtually, and basically told the judge about the problems she was having, and she ended up dying from a medical condition related to her disability claim. Judge approved it, and the lump sum got paid to the son. So that happens, unfortunately, all the time. I think one year that I read where 50 something thousand people died waiting for a decision. Now, SSI dies with you, but SSDI goes to your heirs. James asked, does a 63-year-old going to a hearing next week have a good chance? Cervical spine issues and back and anxiety, PTSD, 9/12 first responder. Again, you're giving me medical, not really diagnoses, but body parts. What are the limitations? Now, at 63, you've got cervical spine issues, back issues. So the grid rules likely come into play, and that, that whole question or that whole point about transferability of skills. So, it's rare that a 63-year-old with objective evidence of back and neck issues, assuming it's significant, would be declined, especially when you've got, in addition to that, anxiety, PTSD, maybe some other issues from 9/11. So I think you probably have a pretty good case. Well, I had a client who was a 9/11 responder, and he was turned down. He was in his late 50s, I think. The problem was the evidence just wasn't strong enough. It was based on breathing problems, but all the breathing tests showed his breathing was basically, more or less normal. And his daily activities were going to the gym and there was not enough there. But it's rare. But I think that, with these problems, you probably have a pretty good shot there. Okay, Russell had to restart his phone. Now you can type in the comments. Watching my videos back in 2019, and they were a help. Well, great. Thank you, Russell. And I appreciate that very much. And that reminds me here, I ask people who are enjoying the live stream or who enjoy my videos to leave me a review. That is always much appreciated. All right, so Forge Mill is asking, does he have to stop working? And you're working shifts, 56 years old, standing and lifting 12-hour shifts. Now, again, the question was, do you have to stop working? And generally speaking, you have to be under SGA. A 12-hour shift, for Social Security purposes, 8 hours a day is considered full-time work. Let's say that the evidence clearly shows you can't work 12-hour shifts. Does it also say you can't work 8-hour shifts? Now, it probably won't make a huge difference at 56, but realize that saying I can't work 12 hours does not mean that you can't work a full-time job. So if the evidence, if the doctors say he can't work 12, but he can work 8, that's not going to help you very much. But I just point that out. So 12-hour shift is considered almost overtime. It's more than full-time. Again, it probably doesn't make a huge difference at 56, but I just point it out because 12 hours is not a normal day's work. I had an ALJ hearing denial on November 26th of 25 for my second claim, onset date November 27th, spoke with the local office, and you set the onset date for January 1. No, I do not know why. Makes no sense to me. You can, I've had a couple times that happen. I'll change it back. I will, in my brief, I'll say we're moving it back to this date or whatever. In fact, I would probably do that sooner rather than later. I would say the onset date is incorrect. It should be the 27th, not the 1st of January. Why give up a month of benefits? Can the grid rules be brought up somehow during reconsideration appeal? Yes, and they should be, because I think some adjudicators don't know to look at them. So I would think absolutely go ahead and do that. I think that would be a wise thing to do. Okay, so ENS says, yeah, I was not at hearing at 49, refiled at 50, went at 51. Why? Because your age category changed. That can be the X factor there, right? If you have a CE exam, are you likely to get it? No, they do CE exams on probably 70% of the cases. My rule of thumb is that psych CEs often help you. The physical CEs usually don't. But that does not mean anything. It just means they just need to develop the record. But it doesn't mean anything negative. Okay, Russell got his application approved the first time, turned 66 in April, less than 1 year ago. Then it changes over to Social Security retirement. Correct. And that's great that you won early. A lot of people don't. That's hard. That's good. Hakasad, you've been here a long time, Hakasad. Not seeing necessity for a laid out brief. Does this make a difference between approval? Leave the ALJ the approval of records, consistency, and CYA SS regulations. Yeah, I think, I do a brief for a couple of reasons. Let me just put this banner back to the um, case evaluation. I do it for a couple of reasons. One is that I think by laying it out, my theory of the case, I think that judges appreciate that because it makes their life a little bit easier. I've had a judge the other day on the record who actually is a 35% approval rate judge. She actually called me before the hearing and it's like, your brief was really, really good. And my briefs are good. I put a lot of time into them. And she's like, it really helped me narrow the issues. They don't often, and she on the record, she complimented me. I'm not saying that to pat myself on the back. It was, I worked hard on it, but I think judges do appreciate it. Not all of them will say anything, but some will. And I think they appreciate it because it lays out the theory. So that's one reason I do it, is because I think it's showing the judge you're prepared. And look, from their perspective, they see people walking into Social Security hearings that are family practitioner or just generalist lawyers, let's put it that way, who dabble in this and they don't know anything and they just sort of walk in there with nothing and put a lot more work on the judge. And so they appreciate when people go to the effort of laying out the theory of the case, taking out issues, let's say changing the onset date if you need to, or recognizing that this is a grid rule case or something like that, saves them time. And it shows respect to the judge. I think the second thing it does is it says to the judge, I know what I'm doing here. I'm not new at this. I will tell you, when I first started, there were a couple of judges who I later became friendly with who you could see it in their eyes, fresh meat. Here's somebody who doesn't really know, hadn't done it that long, and I'm gonna bully him. And they did. There's one judge who several times really tried. And finally, I stood up for myself and I basically challenged him back and he kind of backed off. But they'll try to bully people. Not all judges do it, but some do. It's a power trip. Some judges feel like, okay, I'm the judge and I'm going to show who's boss here. And they'll try to push you around. We'll change the onset date, do this, that. So I think you have to sometimes push back a little bit. By doing a brief, you're saying, I know what I'm doing, and makes it less likely for that to happen. So I think you're showing that you know what you're doing, you're showing respect to the court, and you're laying out the theory of the case. The fourth reason I do it is that hearings are 45 minutes. Judges, most of them ask if you want to give an opening statement. If I give an opening statement that lays out my entire theory of the case, that could take 7 to 10 minutes. I'm using up, more than 10% of the time from the hearing from me blabbing. I want them to hear the client. They don't want to hear me. I can put my opening statement in my brief. Now, some people say you still do one. I don't normally do that. But I think it's just a way to give more time for my client. So, I think a brief really does summarize things. It takes things off the table, it puts things on the table, lets the judge know what you're doing, and they're not going to be able to try to bully you into something. And again, I tell this one story. This is probably now 3 or 4 years ago. There was a judge, I think it was out of Texas. I'd never been in front of him before, and realized hearings used to be in person. Now they're virtual. So this is a couple of years of the virtual hearing world. And my client had, I thought, a pretty decent case. And the judge, before even we started, says, well, counsel, I want you to know what I'm thinking here. And he goes into 20 minutes about why I can find you disabled, your client disabled, but I'm going to change the onset date to, last month. And will you agree to that? And I'm like, no, I'm not going to agree to that. And he said, well, why not? So I gave him all my reasons for it. And he listened. He's like, okay. He goes, you convinced me. You convinced me. I'm not going to ask you to change the onset date. We can go through the hearing now. The hearing took about 10 minutes. He approved it. What was going on there was he was trying to push me around. He'd never seen me before, didn't know anything about me. Okay, I'll approve your case. So I'm going to change that onset date because I'm guessing that judges get bonus points for saving Social Security money. He was trying to get me to agree to an onset date of, no past due benefits. Not going to do it. But, I had to know my file well enough to say why I wasn't going to do it. And I did, and he backed off. I just thought it was a really interesting interesting, hearing. In fact, I saved the audio from that one because I thought I said, now I save all of them. At one point I wasn't saving them all, but that one was kind of interesting because judge, tried to bully me, or maybe bully is the wrong word, tried to pressure me. Wasn't going to have it. So I think, having a good brief really lays out that. And as this one judge from last week told me, she says, sometimes people do these briefs and they don't say anything. They just kind of form, somebody got a form someplace and they don't really say anything. It's almost worse because it's like, you're doing a brief that doesn't do any good and you call it a brief. It's just because the judge is going to look at it and say, this is a BS brief. Why are you wasting my time with it? I just took 7 minutes out of my life. I'll never get back reading nonsense. So it's almost better if you don't have, an argument to make, don't file a brief. But I will tell you that, and there are services out there, just again, so that, as lawyers, we have these services that will take the medical records and kind of combine them into one file, make it easy to work with and download it all from the electronic system and all that stuff, which is very helpful. A lot of these companies offer brief writing services, and they'll have like some attorney someplace that they pay, $200 to draft a brief, like a very generic brief. And I've looked at some of those and I'm like, I wouldn't submit that. It doesn't say anything. Whereas mine are like very detailed. So, sometimes a bad brief can be worse than doing no brief, at least in my opinion. So, all right. Yeah. Okay. I think that, Russell's situation again is sometimes what happens is, somebody looks at it, somebody with brains looks at it and says, this case needs to be approved and let's just get it approved. And that's what you want. That's a good result. Okay, if they change the full retirement age to 70, how would it affect a current 59-year-old on SSDIs? The GOP plan to go after 59-year-old recipients working part-time. No, I think once you're on disability, they have to get you off. The question here would be, if you are 59, when does your disability turn to retirement disability? And again, it doesn't matter because the amounts are about the same, but I would think that it wouldn't happen until the new full retirement age. Now, they have done things, sometimes Social Security makes a change. What they'll do is they will make it retroactive to only certain people. So that could happen as well. But in this situation, I'm thinking that if you are on SSDI, and it converts to regular Social Security, the amount's the same. So whether it happens at 69 or 70 really doesn't matter. Now, would that mean that you might find more CDRs for people in their late 50s, early 60s? Because now you're further away from full retirement? Could mean that, possible. Yep. Saul Ocampo, yes. Recently denied. I'm told it's a normal process. Pinched nerves, recently sent a migraine form, headache questionnaire, which the process of filling out have never really get emphasized to be an issue. Migraines. Yeah, I mean, again, I think what happened here, Saul, is that the adjudicator saw that migraines were something discussed in the medical record, and they want to develop that further. So I think it's a good sign that you have an adjudicator who's actually looking at the medical record. And yeah, it's unfortunate they do decline cases all the time that are deserving. We'll have our say in court, and I think we have a good argument. But the fact they sent you a migraine questionnaire is probably not a bad thing, because it means that somebody's reading the file. And obviously you've got other things going on, the nerve issues, but the migraine, that can be disabling. I've won migraine cases before. I'm helping a guy apply for disability. He's currently getting Medicaid. He is getting services from Easter Seals. This is an interesting question because, if you get on Medicaid, it's income based, right? You qualify for Medicaid because of low income. If you get on disability, sometimes it takes your income over the Medicaid threshold, but you don't get Medicare until 2 years after your first payment. So there can be sometimes situations where winning disability means losing health care for at least a period of time. So that's just something to be concerned about there. I mean, you need to look at when you apply with the onset date being chosen and figure the 5-month waiting period in, assuming he's eligible for SSDI, and figure out when his first payment would be, add 2 years to that, and then figure out when his Medicare payment would be. And then figure out that if he got approved at some time a year from now, let's say, would there be a gap that he has no medical insurance? That's got to be factored into the process. I mean, it doesn't mean you shouldn't apply. It just means disclose that. Let your client, your friend, or whatever know. Okay. You're welcome, Lurker. Yeah, and I think that, again, you've got medical evidence that sounds pretty compelling. There's some adjudicators who just deny people in their 30s. I would definitely appeal this if the medical evidence is there. But I think now you're getting to the functional issues. Before, you were telling me you had a hole in the brain, which is significant, but now you got letters from specialists concerning problems with concentration, poor cognitive function. Those are work limitations. You see, that's what Social Security is all about. So that's why that's really important. Dimple from Ohio. Dimple's been here for months and months. Good to see you, Dimple. All right. CDR at 61. You've already gone through a couple. I think it's pretty unlikely. Yeah. So again, Lurker, one of the questions, step 4, is can you return to past work? I think probably not. Now the question really is there, at 36, I think you were 36, with the problems you've got, is there a simple entry-level, warm body, minimum wage, fog a mirror kind of job you could do? That's really going to be the question. Because I think you can probably eliminate past work. What about anything else could you do? That's really the question. Okay. All right. Got time for a couple more. We're getting close to got 4 or 5 more minutes. Should you let SSA or DDS, ask Lynn, get the medical lab records or forward some for lupus? I used to say let them get them, but I've had other people tell me, Elise Hinton, a former staff attorney who's been a guest here, she says go ahead and send them in. So I'm going to tell you to go ahead and send them in. Let them eliminate duplicates. Let's see. Method listening for cirrhosis, been on disability since then. Also, yeah. So you're asking about CDRs. I think that probably not. I think you said you were 61. I don't think you have to worry about it too much. Super Adam. MS, 2 years of MRIs, 2 neurologists saying disabled, 2 Cs marked, got approved at recon, but onset May 6th. If I appeal onset as a pause by payments, no, you should get your payments and you can appeal, and you probably should appeal. I do it not all the time, but I do it fairly frequently, and I don't want to jinx myself, I've not lost one yet. So I think you're not going to be, I think it's unlikely they're going to find you not disabled, but you can probably push that back a good ways and get a big chunk of money. So, okay, I got time for a couple more here. Then we had a nice crowd today, and I appreciate all the questions. Sorry I can't get to them all, but after about 2 hours, I turn into a pumpkin. So we're going to close it off in a couple minutes here. Are they going to use AI to enforce the rules? Probably. They're starting to use AI, but it's not being used extensively, but it's probably going to become, like everything else, being used more and more. Is it worth requesting a case file before reconsidering appeal? I don't think you have to. I mean, the recon appeal is pretty brief. It's always good to get a copy of the case file so you know what they've got. But I think just the recon appeal, just get it filed. I wouldn't wait on it. Just get it filed. It doesn't really matter what you say, quite frankly, and unless there's a new doctor or something. Anne says, did PT was sent back to the doctor for referral. Doctor said need an MRI. Insurance denied it. If new MRI is really needed, had one in 22 show moderate severe stenosis. A 22 an MRI from 4 years ago. Honestly, MRIs, you can get these for $300-400. If I was you and I could afford it, I would get one on your own, because it sounds like you need to get things moving. Insurance doesn't want to pay for it. If you can scrape together $300-400, get your own, and that may unstick things, because I think having an orthopedist look at you can make a difference. So I wouldn't not do that if you can afford it, or at least appeal the. They can make a decision on the old one, but that's 4 years old now. 4 years old. Okay. Let me get one or two more, then we'll be done here. Good evening, Cajun Sunshine Crafts. Okay. All right, let me address this briefly. Lurker is the person with a brain tumor, currently pregnant. I've had judges imply, never come out and say it, that if you made the decision to get pregnant, and I will, and as you probably know, taking care of a newborn is a lot of work. You're not going to sleep well. It's physically and emotionally demanding. I've had judges kind of give me the side eye, like, you're saying you're disabled, but you decided to get pregnant. We're not going to pay you a paid pregnancy leave. And I know that sounds really harsh. I'm not saying I'm saying this is what judges have kind of implied to me. So that's a factor here. I'm just going to tell you, the fact that you're pregnant is something that could come back, and a judge or adjudicator might say that's a factor to consider, because that's a lot of responsibility. I mean, like I said, I have my 3-month-old grandson 1 day a week, and my 2.5-year-old, we see her all the time. We see her every day, but we're responsible for her, my wife and I, and we're still working. And so but it's a lot of work. I mean, it's a lot of work. I mean, I don't really work on Wednesdays. And so I'm just going to throw that out there. Just be aware of that. KU Thunder, I'm having a good week. Cases approved here. They're saying my first payment. Okay. All right. Cajun Sunshine Crafts. Just to email me directly. Again, we've gotten a bunch of approvals in. I haven't had time to really look at them. I know that Kayana and Christy, Kiki are looking at those, and Paola, but I just have not had time to look at them. Just email me, Jonathan@ssdanswers.com, and we'll take a look at it for you. Thank you for your knowledge. Good. Okay. All right. Let's see here. Okay, I think that makes sense. Educate yourself. Absolutely. Thank you. That's hope you're both charter members of along with Christine, who's not here tonight, of the Jonathan Ginsberg fan club. So, okay, I'll make this the last one here. Chords of gratitude. What happens with veterans with complex PTSD and physical injuries, limiting mobility? Should we apply for SSDI age 59? I mean, at the end of the day, 59 helps. No question. Anybody over 55 has a major advantage there. PTSD is a tough one because it can't be imaged. It's based on medical records. You have physical injuries, which certainly help. I think if you have medical support saying that these problems limit you from being a reliable employee, I think then your chances go up. PTSD alone, that's always been a hard road. I'm just going to tell you. I'm not saying it's the right way, but it's hard. Again, unless you've got indicia of severity, things like inpatient hospitalizations or suicide attempts, or your triggers or common things. I think the physical I would probably focus on more. And if you can get yourself down to a light RFC, again, standing and walking 6 hours, lifting 20 pounds occasionally, and you've got back, physical injuries that limit you that way, and PTSD that impacts your focus and concentration, that lines up for a grid rule case, 202.06. So I'll leave it at that, but that's what I would look at. So anyway, we are at 2 hours and 3 minutes, a little bit over my normal. I really appreciate the great questions, some really smart questions. Thank you all for your great questions. And I hope you'll all join me. I think Spencer is going to be on. Spencer Bishens will be on next week, I believe. Let me just double check that. And Spencer is a former Social Security staff attorney, and he was on before. Let's see. I thought he was going to be on, but maybe I'm wrong. I don't know. Yes, he is on next week. Okay, the 24th. And he was really had some really interesting things to say. Very passionate. He wrote a book about how to win disability, but he's got some really strong opinions from a person who was in the agency. and I think it's worth a listen. But he was a lot of fun to talk to because he was really passionate and very, emotive about what he had to say. So I encourage you to join me next week with Spencer. I hope I should be able to make it. And and typically he's got a book. He'll give away some copies of it, which is always kind of fun. So anyway, hope you all come next week. I hope you have a great weekend. Stay dry wherever you're at. Stay cool, and we will see you all next week, the first week of summer. And this is Jonathan for now. Be well, everybody. Take care of yourselves. Bye-bye.